Chapter 9. The smoke begins to rise. Conrad held Rat's gaze, refusing to show a flicker of fear. The grim room they'd brought him to felt even colder now, Rat's words echoing in the silence. "You're finished, Rats," Conrad said quietly. "I've seen your kind fall before. The bigger the empire, the harder the collapse." Rats let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Funny thing about empires, detective. There's always someone around willing to buy a piece of it." He stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Do you think I haven't covered my tracks? The city needs me, and no one's gonna stick their neck out for a couple of rogue cops." Conrad smirked, feigning a confidence he didn't quite feel. "You've made a lot of enemies, Rats. You really think you can keep them all quiet?" "Money talks," Rats said, flashing that same oily smile. "Louder than you. And once you disappear, that reporter you handed my files to, she'll vanish too." He nodded to his enforcer, who cracked his knuckles as he approached Conrad, fists clenched. But before the enforcer could lay a hand on him, the room was plunged into darkness. Conrad heard a loud bang and felt a rush of cold air as someone kicked in the door. A cacophony of voices followed, shouting and barking orders, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun. "Freeze!" came a voice from the darkness, followed by the sound of scuffling feet and curses. Conrad knew that voice well. It was Maggie. A flashlight cut through the darkness, and Maggie's face emerged, fierce and determined. "Get down!" she yelled, waving him toward her. "We need to go, now." Rats, disoriented, stumbled backward, and his enforcer swung wildly in the dark. Conrad took the opportunity, knocking the enforcer back with a swift punch before diving toward Maggie. She grabbed his arm, and together, they bolted through the door as the lights flickered back on, illuminating Rat's furious expression. "Get them!" Rat screamed, his voice twisted with rage. Maggie and Conrad sprinted down the corridor, pushing through the crowd in the main hall. Partygoers gasped and scattered, and for a moment, Conrad could see Walker's face in the crowd, her eyes wide with shock but her hand still clutching the briefcase tightly. She gave him a quick nod, slipping out through a side door as chaos erupted in the room. Conrad and Maggie reached the main exit, but as they neared it, two more of Rat's men stepped in their path. Maggie barely hesitated, grabbing a champagne bottle from a nearby table and swinging it at one of the guards, who staggered back, clutching his head. Conrad moved in quickly, taking down the other guard with a well-aimed kick to the knee. They broke through the doors and into the night, running across the lawn and into the shadows of the parking lot. The flash of headlights and the sound of tires screeching to a halt caught Conrad's attention. Lawson pulled up in a battered sedan, his face set in grim determination. "Get in," he shouted, throwing open the passenger door. Conrad and Maggie leapt in, and Lawson hit the gas, sending the car rocketing out of the driveway and down the darkened street. Behind them, the mayor's mansion grew smaller, its lights fading as they sped into the heart of the city. In the car, they took a moment to catch their breath, the weight of the night settling over them like a heavy blanket. Lawson shot a glance in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We did it," he said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Walker's out of there, and with the files. By morning, it'll be all over the news." Maggie leaned back, closing her eyes. "If she makes it out safely. Rat's men are everywhere tonight." Conrad, catching his breath, felt a strange calm washing over him. Walker's tougher than she looks. If anyone can get those files to the press, it's her. By the time Rats even realizes what's happening, the city will know every name in the Vermin list. Lawson nodded, glancing over at Conrad with a rare, unspoken respect. "You were right about Rats. He won't stop trying to squash this, and he'll go after anyone who even breathes a hint of that list. We've only got hours, maybe less, before he retaliates." Conrad thought of Rats back in that cold, dark room, his expression contorted with fury. He'll want revenge, but now, it'll be in the public eye. He can't do it quietly anymore. Lawson pulled the car into a side street, easing off the gas as they slowed to a stop behind a closed bookstore. It was a quiet spot, surrounded by the familiar shadows of a city street barely awake. He turned off the engine, and they sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic. "I have a friend," Lawson said finally, breaking the silence. "A contact in the marshal's office. He can help protect us if we can get to him before Rats tracks us down." Conrad looked at Lawson, weighing the offer. "A safe house. That could buy us time, at least until we're sure the list has made it to the press." Lawson nodded, glancing at Maggie. "But we'll have to lay low, maybe even disappear. This will be Rat's last stand, and he'll make it ugly." The idea of disappearing, of giving up everything he'd worked for, hung heavy in the air. But Conrad knew it might be the only way to stay alive long enough to see Rats brought down. He met Maggie's eyes, seeing the same resolve he felt reflected there. "If it means Rats finally goes down, I'll do it. Whatever it takes." Maggie leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Then let's do this. We'll get to your contact, lie low, and watch this city tear him apart." Early the next morning, as the city began to stir, the New York Herald hit the stands with the headline, "The Vermin List, Exclusive A Web of Corruption from the Docks to City Hall." Sarah Walker's byline glared back at Conrad from the newspaper he'd snagged from a vendor near their safe house. The front page was packed with names, photos, and summaries of Rats' operations, evidence from the Vermin List now for every citizen to see. The story spread like wildfire, dominating every channel, every conversation. Phones rang off the hook in city offices, police precincts were flooded with inquiries, and the mayor was forced to issue a statement calling for a full investigation into the officials listed. Rats had become public enemy number one overnight. Back at their safe house, they watched the news unfold from a dusty couch, every headline flashing like a victory banner. But even in their triumph, Conrad felt the weight of what was coming. They heard the faint rumble of engines outside, and Lawson glanced at the window, his face taut with apprehension. He gestured for everyone to get down, his voice a harsh whisper. "Get ready. If Rats knows we're here, he's going to come in hard." The next moment, the roar of engines grew louder, and headlights swept across the safe house. Conrad felt a chill crawl up his spine as he heard the slam of car doors, followed by the sound of heavy boots hitting pavement. "They found us," Maggie whispered, eyes wide. Conrad felt his heartbeat quicken as he reached for his sidearm, his mind racing through their options. It was the final reckoning, a showdown that had been inevitable since the moment they'd stolen the Vermin List. As the footsteps drew closer, Conrad took one last look at Maggie and Lawson, the people who'd fought beside him to bring Rats down. "Remember," he said quietly, a determined glint in his eye. "We've already won. No matter what happens here, Rats is finished." Maggie gave him a fierce nod, her eyes blazing with the same fire. "Then let's make sure he knows it." The door burst open, and as the first of Rat's men stepped through, Conrad raised his gun, his heart steady, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 10, Reckoning in the shadows. The door crashed open, sending splinters across the dusty floor as Rat's men stormed into the safe house. Conrad, Maggie, and Lawson flattened against the walls, pistols ready, their breaths shallow as they took in the armed men swarming in. This was it, their final chance to end this. The lead enforcer, a hulking man with a scar running down his face, swept his gun through the room, barking orders. "Decepto. Lawson. Show yourselves. Mr. Malone wants a word." A heartbeat of silence followed. Then, with a sharp nod from Conrad, Maggie took the lead, stepping into view with her weapon aimed at the enforcer's head. "Tell Mr. Malone we're not interested in a word," she said, voice steely. Maggie took the lead, stepping into view with her weapon aimed at the enforcer's head. The enforcer smirked, raising his own gun. But he never got the chance to fire. Conrad emerged from the shadows and took his shot, the bullet landing squarely in the enforcer's shoulder. He staggered, his face twisting in pain and surprise. "Move!" Conrad shouted. The three of them scattered, darting around the room as gunfire erupted, bullets whizzing through the air, ripping into the walls and furniture. Each shot felt like a thunderclap in the small space, but Conrad's focus was absolute. He moved with precision, taking down one of Rat's men with a shot to the leg, while Maggie took cover, firing rapidly. Lawson ducked behind a heavy bookshelf, his gun trained on the door. "We can't hold them off forever," he shouted. "We need an escape route." Conrad scanned the room, noting the boarded-up window in the corner. "There," he called, gesturing. "That's our way out." The three of them pressed forward, fighting their way toward the window. Lawson pulled back a table to use as cover, returning fire to buy them time. As they reached the window, Maggie took a crowbar she'd grabbed earlier and began prying the boards loose, her arms straining as she worked. Outside, the roar of engines grew louder. More of Rat's men were arriving, the headlights slicing through the early morning fog, casting eerie shadows through the broken window. The odds were stacking up, but Conrad knew they couldn't back down. This was their last chance. "Maggie, hurry," Lawson called, covering her as she wrested the last board free. They could see the street beyond, still empty save for the approaching cars. With the window cleared, Conrad glanced back at the room. "Go," he urged, giving Maggie a gentle push. She slipped through the opening, landing on her feet just as Lawson followed, squeezing through and stumbling onto the pavement. Conrad was the last out, leaping through just as another shot echoed behind him, barely missing his arm. Outside, they sprinted through the narrow alley, weaving through the shadows, their footsteps echoing off the buildings. They ran past closed storefronts and shuttered buildings, searching for cover as the sound of pursuit closed in. They rounded a corner and spotted an abandoned van. Conrad yanked the door open and ushered Maggie and Lawson inside, slamming it shut behind them. Lawson scrambled into the driver's seat, frantically searching for wires he could use to hotwire it. He had barely begun when a line of headlights swept around the corner, Rat's convoy barreling toward them. "Lawson, now would be a great time," Maggie shouted, peering out the window. Lawson grunted, his hands working furiously. A moment later, the engine roared to life, and he stomped on the gas, the van jerking forward just as Rat's men opened fire. Bullets thudded against the metal as they sped off, weaving through narrow streets and back alleys, trying to lose their pursuers. After several tense minutes, they managed to put enough distance between themselves and Rat's men to take a breath. The van tore through a maze of alleyways and finally screeched to a halt under an old stone bridge, the city quiet around them once more. They sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath, their hearts still pounding. "That was close," Maggie said, looking at Conrad, her face pale but resolved. "But we're not out of this yet." Conrad nodded, glancing at his watch. "We've bought time, but Rats won't stop until he finds us. We need to end this, tonight." Lawson leaned forward, his face set in grim determination. "Then we take it to him directly. Rats has men on the streets, but he'll be watching the fallout from his penthouse, surrounded by his top enforcers. If we take the fight to him there, it's over." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we break into the lair of New York's most powerful criminal and take him down ourselves?" Lawson met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting. He'll have fewer men with him, and his operations exposed now. He'll be off balance. It's now or never." Conrad agreed. "Let's finish this." They drove in silence to Rat's building, parking several blocks away. Conrad looked up at the towering structure, its glass windows reflecting the early morning light. They knew Rats would be holed up in the penthouse, overseeing the chaos from the very top. They moved through the shadows, taking a freight elevator to the roof and using a maintenance staircase to descend quietly. They crept through the halls until they reached the penthouse suite. Conrad took a deep breath, gripping his pistol. "On my count." Maggie and Lawson nodded, and Conrad pushed open the door, stepping into the lavish penthouse. The space was opulent, furnished in dark leather and polished wood, the skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Rats was at the far end, talking furiously on the phone, his back to them. But he turned at the sound of their footsteps, his face twisting in fury as he saw them. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Rats snarled, hanging up the phone and reaching into his jacket. Conrad leveled his gun. It's over, rats. The city knows. Your empire is finished. But Rats laughed, his voice dripping with contempt. You really think the city cares? They'll forget this in a week. And so will you, if you're still breathing. He reached into his jacket, pulling a pistol from a holster. But Conrad was faster, pulling the trigger just as Rat's gun came up. The shot echoed through the penthouse, Rat staggering back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mix of shock and rage. In that moment, Maggie and Lawson moved in, flanking him as he tried to raise his weapon again. With swift, precise movements, Maggie disarmed him, wrenching the gun from his grip and shoving him against the wall. Conrad stepped forward, leveling his gaze at Rats. It's over. Your men are scattered, the DA's office is launching an investigation, and every reporter in the city is hounding the trail you left behind. Rats glared, his face twisted with fury, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He knew he was cornered, his empire crumbling. You'll regret this, Decepto, he spat. When this city's left with nothing but chaos, you'll see you needed me. Conrad shook his head, unflinching. The city needs justice, Rats. Not a parasite like you. As they held him there, the sound of sirens filled the air, echoing through the penthouse. The police were on their way, finally catching up to the chaos Rats had left behind. A few minutes later, officers stormed in, taking Rats into custody. The last they saw of him was his face contorted in anger, hands cuffed, being led out by the officers he'd once controlled. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, Conrad, Maggie, and Lawson stood on the steps outside the precinct, watching as the news vans arrived, cameras flashing. The entire city would soon know the details of Rat's downfall. Maggie turned to Conrad, a smile playing on her lips. We did it. We took him down. Conrad nodded, a rare sense of satisfaction settling over him. We did. And the city will be better for it. Lawson, his face weary but triumphant, clapped Conrad on the shoulder. The city owes you one, Decepto. We all do. As the sunlight cast a warm glow over the city streets, Conrad felt the weight of victory and justice wash over him. It had been a hard fight, but New York was finally free of Rats Malone's grip. For the first time in years, the city could breathe. And as they walked away from the precinct, they knew that, while there would always be another case, another threat, they'd left a mark on the city that would endure. The streets were safer, the shadows receding, and for Conrad Decepto, that was enough.